Wait a minute. What's so amazing about grace?
You are listening to All Things Grace podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Majors. This podcast is dedicated to answering one question: how can we move through life with more ease and flow and grace? How do we bring grace to family drama, our careers, our bodies, and health? What about racism and oppression? Or the most challenging of them all, ourselves? It's all about grace, y'all. Let's talk about it. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to All Things Grace podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Majors, and joining me today are Tilman Smith and Ilsa Govan, authors of the book, What's Up with White Women? Unpacking Sexism and White Privilege in Pursuit of Racial Justice. So Tilman, I've known Tilman I've had the pleasure of working with you a few times, but it's been a few years, I'd say. But Tilman has been an educator for over 30 years, serving as a classroom teacher, administrator, field supervisor, college instructor, caucus facilitator, trainer, and coach, and the list goes on. She has facilitated workshops throughout the country on the topics of anti-bias curriculum, white privilege, internalized sexism, and internalized white superiority, and co-founded 2 community white caucuses in the Puget Sound area that supported educators and community activists for over 20 years. While Tilman has contributed to many literary works on anti-racism and cross-cultural competency, today we are here to talk about her newest project with Ilsa Govan, What's Up with White Women? Unpacking Sexism and White Privilege in the Pursuit of Racial Justice. All right, Ilsa. So Ilsa has extensive experience as a facilitator, consultant, writer, and social justice advocate and activist. As co-founder of Cultures Connecting, she has led conversations. I've attended your workshop and it was amazing. Workshops and conferences across the country. Ilsa volunteers to coordinate the White Caucus at the annual National White Privilege Conference. I didn't know such a thing existed. And prior to Cultures Connecting, Ilsa worked as an equity and race specialist for Seattle Public Schools. Oh, my goodness, working as an equity and race specialist. Hats off to you. Deep bow, Ilsa, for Seattle Public Schools. And also just deeply invest in your own growth and examining how your own identity influences your interactions with others, particularly through the lens of privilege and oppression. Again, as the co-author here, I'm ready to dive into this book. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here for this conversation today.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, what prompted this book?
Ilsa, so first let me just say thank you for having us, for reading our book, for wanting to have this conversation. I've always had such respect for you, Michelle, so this is especially wonderful to be with you. Thank you. And the other thing I want to start with is that I knew Ilsa before we started doing work on this book or writing this book. She went to the same college where I worked, and most importantly, she was my youngest son's 5th grade teacher.
Oh, wow.
And she saved us at a time when I was an activist in the school, and I had made I challenged some things in the school, and it was a really tough time for all of us, and especially for my son. And Ilsa just embraced all of us. So there's just huge love and admiration for who she is. So both of us out there were educators. We care deeply. We wanted to be the best anti-racist that we could be. And Michelle, we kept getting indications, comments, hints, direct communication that we as white women were problematic, both personally and as an idea. And I was puzzled and embarrassed that I couldn't figure out, like, why do people of color see this so easily and I don't? Like, yikes, I should be able to see what the problem is really.
Mhm.
And so I asked Ilsa and another friend of ours, MG, to come together. And we just started right, Ilse, with that question. We met regularly trying to figure out what is it about us that's problematic?
Mm.
How does it show up? And how can we support each other to figure out how to be different? That's my recollection.
That's pretty accurate. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And thanks, Michelle. I also Tilman, feel the love. And I I think I don't have a whole lot to add to that, except that like we just like started talking about stories. We start making lists. We're very good at making lists. So we started asking more people of color who were that we were already in relationship with and engaged with in conversation about what they were noticing about white women. And
Mm.
I remember Tilman coming to one of our little dinners together one time and being like, I have this list from my friend. Here's the things she said we need to work on. And like, okay. And so really it was originally this exploration of self.
Mhm.
And how can we better show up as allies and advocates for racial justice? How can we live into the values that we hold so dear? And what are we missing about the ways that we're not living into that? And then that eventually turned into us having workshops in the community, us developing this model of identity development that we write about in the book that felt like a really useful tool for us. And we got a lot of feedback from other people. It was useful for them. And then eventually deciding that we would put that into a book format and capture people's stories along the way so that hopefully we could illustrate what we were finding out for a larger audience and possibly connect with other white women who are interested in becoming more racially just in their everyday lives.
We thought, how are we going to be able to reach more white women? And thought that perhaps writing a book would be a good way to do it. And we wanted to do it in a way that created transparency and accountability, responsibility. So our hope is that people of color will read it and give us feedback. We've asked people of color to read it before we published it, and we have a great story that we'll share at some point about the feedback we got after one of our dear friends read it and had some very serious direct feedback about white women's innocence. And so it's really a conversation for everybody, but I know that I did it to hold myself responsible and to deepen the conversation for me.
Mhm.
We definitely have had people of color who've read it and been like, I work with her. Thank you. Like, thank you for naming that. Like, I know that person. I've met her. That's my mom, and so so I feel like there is some resonance from folks of color who have read it, where it's an affirmation of like, oh, I've been thinking about this and maybe even questioning myself around like, am I making too much of this or what's going on here? And the book has offered some deeper insight as well in that way. And yeah, but just to amplify what Tilman was saying, we wrote it as a love letter to our white sisters and an invitation for deeper conversation.
Tilman, I would love, now that you put it out there, Tilman, I would love to hear some of that feedback. You already put it out there, so now you have to share some of the feedback.
Yeah, I saw your face like, oh, okay, what's that story? Well, so after we wrote the whole manuscript, we sent it to different people. Some white people, some people of color that we were in relationship with, and we asked them, would they be willing to give us true feedback? And such generosity, such breadth of experience and wisdom was shared with us. And what I think I noticed was for most of the people of color that we sent it to, they read maybe up to 3 chapters, skim the rest, and they're like, we're good, like, move along. And there was one person in particular who, Dr. Rachel Chapman, she's a professor at University of Washington, absolutely brilliant woman in every way. She took our manuscript and she took, I would say, perhaps a couple of months to really read it. And we were getting close to the deadline with our publisher, and we're like, hey, have you finished it? And she finally said, I'm not sure I'm going to share with you what I've done, because I'm not sure our friendship, our relationship will be able to survive what feedback I want to give you. So we'll see if I even share it with you. So huge risk on her part, right? And so we're like, fine, you please do what you need to do, what makes sense to you. We will be here, we promise, if you decide to give us the feedback. So Michelle, she did give us the feedback. And you see my face. It was, there were a lot of marks, comments throughout it. I would say hundreds of indications of where she named that Ilsa and I let ourselves off the hook. Naming it white women's innocence of, oh, we just didn't understand, or we didn't see it, or we wish we had done it differently, or this is why we didn't do it differently. I mean, she took the time to name each time in our completed manuscript when we had done that. Like, wow, ow, and wow. And Ilsa and I went through it and we're like, oh, she is so right. Oh, wow, how did we not see this? Like, what a risk she took, what grace she gave us to say, hold on. So luckily our publisher was willing to hold off so we could make most of the changes that she had indicated needed to be made. And the book is just infinitely better.
Yeah, that's really great. I think one of the things that I'm thinking about immediately is when time clashes with like process and authenticity and like, a better product. And I see that all the time, when we have, even with my clients, when we create this very sophisticated and nuanced hiring practice, and then the development person leaves and you're you're over budget, and you know somebody who would be excellent and you can get them in right now, and you have to make that choice between making this decision and abandoning the process that we've spent time, which only just defeats the process, but it has an effect on morale and that same feeling of tokenism. Like, well, why did we do this, right? And so the fact that one, this person was willing to take the time, but two, that you actually pushed the deadline back to be able to honor that time. And so that's kind of what I'm grabbing from the story. But oftentimes there's the clash between time and process, for sure.
Yeah. I think about that a lot, of like in racial equity work, the urgency of now and the time necessary to be strategic and inclusive and engaging and have that, that culture of belonging. And I also think about that in the context of white women's identity and the intersection of sexism and white privilege, where we will reinforce the notion that we don't have the time. And so when we were doing this, I was like, okay, well, if she doesn't get it to us, the rules say that we just, like, we've already given it to the publisher. I mean, I guess we can ask them, but they're probably not going to let us do this because the rules say, and to actually work with New Society Press, which I love them as a publisher and want to shout them out because they were just like, oh yeah, oh of course, I wasn't even going to challenge it. And in the way that Tilman and I write about this and see it connected to sexism and white privilege is that white men are making the rules and white women are in this buffer zone, as Paul Kivel names it, in this position of often enforcing the rules.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and we have closer relationships with people of color. And so this instance is a clear illustration of that, where we have this relationship with a Black woman and a white male structure has said, and even the people working for our publisher, predominantly white, has said, like, this is the timeline that you have to get this in. And then my first impulse is to just be like, that's the rule, right? And so we see that pattern also showing up in organizations where white women will also be the ones who are most likely to enforce a rule. When Tilman and I give an assignment to a table group or a breakout group, there's always like Helpful Holly who's like, are we doing this right? What is the assignment? What are we supposed to be doing? And then, her friend who's also a white woman will come in and re-explain everything to everyone in the group of what you're supposed to be doing. Or we come into a room and we rearrange the chairs because they need to be just right, even though we're not the ones hosting the party. And so I just think of, it's an important piece of that story, and it's also connected to the work that we do specifically with white women.
Yeah, and so there was a story in there where it was Tilman and your son was just born, and you had to go to some event or some party, and it was 2 months, and you're like, I'm not going to put my 2-month-old on a plane and fly here. And so you really didn't want to do it. You really didn't want to do it. But there was this, and this is a universal thing, there was this being a good girl, being a good daughter, being right, and honoring the parents and honoring what family would say about you. So a lot of those family dynamics kind of came out. But then it was so interesting because I locked in and I felt it. And I was like, yes, I know that, where you have to, there's this unconscious, like there's no, you can't argue it. You have to do it, even though everything in your body's like, I don't want to, I'm not going to. So then you get there, you can't find a babysitter. So then you have to go to a professional or whatever. And at your door shows up, a thin Black girl with an afro, and you termed it a slinky, a slinky dress and platforms, right? And then you were like, oh, all your stuff came up. And it's so interesting as a Black woman. The first thing I thought of is like, there it is. It's that pivot. It's that head whiplashing kind of effect of, oh yeah, and then, oh man, no, there's always this, I feel like a lot of times where you're endeared to someone and then that thing happens, and then all of a sudden they're not somebody that you know or you care about, but they're a white woman, and then you have to reconcile your own experience, and then if they feel bad, then you have to reconcile their experience. It's just a lot. And so I remember feeling that sense of like, oh my goodness, why, come on, Tilman, come on. And then I remember when I flew to Jamaica years ago, I get on the plane and I look in the cockpit and there are 2 Black women, and I'm like, oh, wow, that's cool. Their stewardess wears captain hats, because my mind couldn't get around. And when she says, hey, I'm, welcome, I'm your captain, and said a name, and I was like, I felt in my body like this, wait, and I realized I like my pilots, old, experienced, quote unquote, old, experienced white men. And then I had to stop and go, wow, like that's internalized sexism, internalized oppression. And even all of it came out because one of them had on what I perceived to be a lot of makeup. And that was a conflict with someone who's smart, and right. So I need you to be like focused on your books, not your looks. So all of my stuff about how competent they were, it was right there front and center. And I had a friend in my community that's a pilot, right? And so, but it just, it didn't connect. And so there is that piece that we all do, but the difference is you're situated in a place of power where yours can have an effect. If you're a barista and you're like, I don't feel comfortable with Michelle here, I feel uncomfortable, I could go out in handcuffs. That probably won't happen with you. So I just wanted to raise that piece of, I understood it, I saw it, and we're all trying to reconcile, like, how do we get along and how do we work together? We're not all trying to figure that out. Some of us are trying to figure out what that looks like. So I appreciated both the person who read it, who said, no, you're giving yourself a pass. You're letting yourselves off the hook. But then also I appreciate the writing of the book, and that you were like, hey, we're gonna speak to this thing. So I want to pivot just a second, because this podcast is called All Things Grace. And I know that a lot of folks have concerns and questions about this idea of grace in the space of race and racism, and who gets grace, and what does that mean? And I had one of my clients, a white woman, yesterday said, I feel like the idea of grace like I do about the American flag. Like, when I see it, I know it doesn't apply to many, many people, or it's not seen as something that other people are part of or get to have, right? And so what are your thoughts about this idea of grace, how it plays out, the potential weaponizing of grace, and in particular as white women, what would that look like for you as far as the grace you need and the grace that you feel that white women should afford?
I was thinking, as you were sharing your story and thinking about Tilman's story and the stories that I wrote in the book, where this idea of grace is that I am taking responsibility for those moments in my life where my bias has shown up and my bias has caused harm to other people. And I'm giving myself grace to grow from that experience. Like, I feel like if we're sharing these stories without having grace for ourselves, then we're going to get stuck in this shame spiral that doesn't benefit anyone, that does not allow us to work towards justice, because we'll continue to center ourselves and how we felt in that moment until we're able to say, okay, that was a mistake, rather than I didn't mean it, which is like, okay, well then let's make it about me, or I'm so sorry. And so now it's about me, and now it's about your forgiveness of me. And then I see that. So I think that those are a couple of ways that I connect with, like, the need for grace for ourselves in order to learn and grow. And then the weaponizing that I see is, just for an example, I was doing a workshop the other day. Caprice and Dr. Caprice Hollins, my business partner, amazing woman, just need to say, get her name in here, because she is so much a part of my life and everything that I do and all of my thoughts. And we're doing a workshop together. And one, we ask people, what do you hope in these conversations? And people are like, I hope my child can get home safely. I hope for an end to racism. And somebody puts grace. And we're tracking, we're like, okay, that's a white man who just put, like, his hope in race conversations is that people will give him grace. So that's where I think that terminology gets used to say, oh, well, I don't need to be held accountable. I don't need to be responsible. What really needs to happen is that you need to stop making such a big deal out of the mistakes that I make, and just give me some space, as if we as white people haven't had all of this space. And now we're asking for a little something more from people of color, not realizing that people of color have more than met us halfway.
So how did you, this is huge and really important, because I've seen that person in one of my trainings. I've heard them, my girlfriend says she had a training where all the white men showed up with shirts with, like, targets on them, because apparently, so my question is, what did you say? How did you create dialogue around that nonsense? And what came of it? And did it change the space in any way?
You know, one of the things that we try to practice is we used to get into a lot of power struggles with the people who are most resistant in racial equity workshops. We actually need 20 to 25% of the population to be invested in racial equity in order to see huge systems change. Like change happens with far less than half the population. And yet we would invest a lot, Caprice and I, time and energy in engaging with the most resistant person. So in this moment, we thought, there's this guy. Let's see what else he's putting in chat. Let's see what other kind of comments he's making. And just getting a sense of like, yeah, this is like, we feel like we know where he's coming from in this. Then what we did strategically, rather than centering that person in the conversation, possibly getting into a power struggle, which, you know, we will lose anytime there's a power struggle. The person doing the racial justice training loses. And so we put him into breakouts with people that we knew were white allies. And we didn't put him into breakout groups with any people of color. And we're like, okay, let's just do some like mini interventions where like we know this person can have a one-on-one conversation and hopefully reach him in a different way. And that was how we chose to address that particular time, honestly.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
How do you address, when I thought about this book, I heard some of my colleagues going, okay, white women profiting on, conversations about race and sexism. Have you heard that? And what has been your response or thought about you both of you profiting from this struggle that is so devastating to folks of color?
Yeah, great question. So one of the things we did, this is the easy fix. I have my hands in air quotes, is we thought about profiting from this book. People had told us, unless you're a bestseller, you're not going to make much money. But even that we thought, but how does it feel to make much, like any money from this book? So we proactively chose two organizations that we give the proceeds to. One is Delbert Richardson's organization, The Unspoken Truths, just an amazing traveling museum. Highly recommend it for anybody in the Seattle area, in the world, to be able to experience. And the other is Suru for Solidarity, which is an organization founded by Japanese Americans who were incarcerated in World War II, trying to address the reality of the camps on our southern border that are replicating the same incarceration experience that they had. So that is the quote unquote easy fix. And the reality is, when you write a book and it's out there, it gives you exposure and status that not everybody gets. So I do make a living by talking about racism, by working with white people, by being in the public eye. And I think a lot about my responsibility for that, what that looks like. And part of it is being open to questions like this, being open to criticism, critique, guidance, things like Dr. Chapman did for us, to think about, gosh, which way should I be going? Is this appropriate? Is it not? I personally don't have a problem making a living doing the work that I do, as long as I know that I am willing to change, to make changes that may impact my bottom line if they're perpetuating racism. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
Mhm.
So a
Mhm.
lot of it is that the need to be honest, the need to have humility, the
Mhm.
need to genuinely receive feedback. And this is not about me being a good or bad person. I just am. So,
Mhm.
one of the things that we are really grappling with is just because we do this work doesn't mean we're good people.
Mhm. Mhm.
It
Mhm.
has nothing to do with being good or bad. The opposite of being racist is not being good. The opposite of being racist is being anti-racist. So each time I connect with somebody, no matter what our financial relationship is, my job is to tell the truth as I see it,
Mhm.
even if it means that we are going to sever our relationship.
Mhm.
How does that sit with you, Michelle? Like, how do you feel about white people making money doing this work, if you're willing to share?
Yeah, so this is where grace comes in, right? This is my thought is that it takes all of us to do this work. And if we're really honest, you are not equally, you are also impacted by this system and arrangement of racism.
Mhm.
And if we're honest about it, you're also impacted by the system of, sexism and other things, right? But the ways in which, so you're situated in a place of power where people can hear you. I think
Yes.
it's important that there's different people telling the story, that there's this door called liberation, and we're all walking in the doors that we want to walk in, that are best for our soul, that are best for our mission, our journey, our voice in life. And so I think it's important that there are different models of people telling this story. They're going to hear better from y'all than they will from me. And it could be a Black woman that hears it better from y'all than from me, right? Because they're like, she's wounded, Michelle's wounded. I don't want to hear from her. I want to hear from the people who are part of the wounding, right? So I think it's equally important for all of us to attack these things for this huge Goliath of a giant that we're all dealing with from different perspectives. I have a problem. I think I have a problem with it when what's being said is lacking in context. It's lacking in analysis. So I was at a school or college, I will not name it, but there was a white student who was very, very active against the death penalty. People came onto campus one day and there was just there were nooses hanging all over campus. Like, this could be your loved one. Of course, the Black folks on campus were absolutely devastated and traumatized.
Yes.
When there was, forums about it, and the person who did it doubled down, because there was no question about your passion and commitment to it. There's no question about that. There's a question in how your passion and commitment is focusing or harming the people that you're saying that you are for, right? That kind of analysis is missing sometimes in some of these books. And then sometimes the books get so big that they become the movement and not the people who they represent.
Yes.
And so that becomes an issue as well. So I think, to say that you have folks not only critique your book, but you even were like, let's scratch this and do all of this extra hours, hundreds, tens, I don't know how many hours it took, but like the time to make it, to honor the voices that we are saying that we're allies to. So I think it can be, I think it's good when it's good, and dangerous when it's not good.
Yes.
So thank you for asking me that. Nobody's ever asked me a question on my own podcast. Yeah, this is great. I had a question about white tears. I am a human centered person first. I personally, when a white woman starts crying, typically, if I have a relationship with them, I give space for that, right? Because that's a human thing, and we are caring for one another. I'm not the person that's like, you're white, you go cry somewhere else. I'm here for it, and I'm here for you. But I can also kind of tell when it's manipulative. And I think that's because I've been doing it for so long. but also you feel it. It's an instinct. And I think part of this stuff, this racism and sexism, you deny your own instincts, i.e., put your son on a plane when you didn't want to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, what are your thoughts?
I've been socialized to cry in any given situation. Sometimes it's to get what I want. Sometimes it's because I'm watching, as I say in the book, Little Tears on the Prairie. Sometimes it's just because, it's just so like that is the go-to sanctioned emotional response for white women. And with white men, it really works to help me to get what I want or need in a situation. And Tilman describes that even more like in situations that are abusive. And so we don't believe that white women's tears are always harmful. And I also know and in working with people of color, they very often are, right? And in my relationships with people of color, they very often are. So we've taken something that's very well adapted to engaging with white men and white supremacy society, and then maladapted, or it shows up in our relationships with people of color. So just thinking about that context, I might not even realize when I'm crying that I'm trying to manipulate the situation consciously, because I'm so invested in my goodness, my niceness, the mythology of white women's innocence. And the way that I demonstrate that is through my tears, that I might actually believe that that is the case, even when it is not. And so I think there's like that. So when white women are in later stages, there's also this point at which in my life, I was like, not going to cry, never going to cry, and so I would just like get up and walk out of the room if I felt like I was having an emotional response to something. So my folks of color are sharing a vulnerable story around something, an experience of racism. And I get up and walk out of the room because I can't manage my emotions, or because I think that like having an empathic response is the wrong thing to do because somebody told me that's a rule of anti-racism. So it's that both and knowing that like in the moment, yeah, I have my tissues. I'm showing them right now. I have my tissues right here with me all the time. In the moment, what can I do so that the conversation doesn't become about me and my tears, me and my emotional response? Michelle, anti-racist activists are even like folks with a lot of consciousness. Like I had a Black man come up to me after a time where I was crying, and he was like, I just need to give you a hug. And I'm like, I know you care about me. You really don't just need to give me a hug. Like I am okay. And so Tilman and I really feel like we hold the reality of no matter what we say or do, there will likely be impact that our tears have on Black and brown people in conversation.
I want to back up to that.
Yeah.
So the Black man comes up and says, hey, I want to give you a hug. And you say, what did you actually say? And why do you feel like that wasn't, what's behind you saying, no, you don't need to give me a hug. I'm okay.
I said, thank you. I'm okay. And he said, no, I really need to give you a hug. And so I hugged him. And my concern is that there's this like sexist, I need to take care of you relationship.
Yes.
And I need to check in with you, white woman who was crying, rather than my colleagues of color who were sharing their experiences of pain that actually triggered your crying response.
And part of that, I wonder, is the understanding that Ilsa's whiteness, her status in that situation, was he also making sure about his own safety? Whoa, white woman cried. Want to make sure she's okay so it doesn't come back to bite me. And so, I mean, it's fraught. White women's tears are fraught with so much complication. Ilsa and I were in a peace circle one time, just a beautiful group of people that we admire and care about. And it was a place for us to really go deep and explore. So the both of us cried quite a bit in the peace circle. And at the end of it, one of the participants, a man of color, just said, "Oh, I am so triggered by your tears. And you're just, here you go." And so in the moment, I felt like, "Ugh, I can't win," right? I just had that flash of like, I can't win. And then it occurred to me, both are true. I am deeply moved in a place where I really felt I could cry. And of course, it triggered you. Ah, I am sorry. Like, it's not either or, it's both and. And I don't have to be perfect or right or good. Like, it just is sometimes.
It's just so complex, and I say this all the time. Well, I've said it once here, racism has us deny our basic human instinct. If you take racism out of the equation, of course you were crying because you were moved. That's a human thing. And I think that's why white spaces are important, so that you can have that experience. But I think that as long as we are teaching ourselves to compartmentalize who we are, then it's harder to connect. Now, as a Black woman, I compartmentalize all the time. I shared the story in one of the last podcasts about out here doing my yard. And my neighbor came out and was basically telling me, "Hey, you really keep your yard up. And I've had all these concerns about living with Black neighbors. And you've really kind of just broke that whole stereotype up. Yay, you," kind of a thing, right? And the decision tree, and make a decision, like go through all of it. So the compartmentalizing, it happens when I go to the store. It happens with everywhere I go and how I move in the world. So it stands to reason that as white women, you have your compartmentalizing to do. But I just feel like as long as I'm compartmentalizing and you're compartmentalizing, I'm not seeing your vulnerability. You're not able to see my vulnerability because I'm like, I can't deal with you. I can't do this. And so how do we build this thing? I know a lot of people, or I assume a lot of people, will have a lot of problems with this idea of us folks of color being vulnerable. And I think that because that's a dangerous thing. I don't think we have any evidence in our history to say, yeah, I think you should be vulnerable. I think you should trust white people. What's the worst that could happen, right? But I also then go, okay, but how do we do it? And I look at the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa. And how do you get to, post-apartheid from where you are? There has to be a mechanism, a process, a way for us to move the needle collectively in some way. Even if it's just that 25%, there has to be a way. And as long as I'm afraid and you're shameful or guilty or embarrassed, and I'm angry and, distanced, that's why I'm doing this thing, because I believe grace is the only mechanism that I've seen that says, I don't know what I don't know. I recognize just you can harm me and I can harm you. And maybe the idea, and I always kind of feel like the idea is that white folks should extend first, right? Like extend, but then there's also such a fundamental distrust that when you do, you have to extend the right way. You have to say the right thing at the right time and say the right words to the right person, because we're not a monolith. So some other Black woman may see it totally different, right? And so it's a dance that we're all kind of doing. And I'm speaking only to people who are on the dance floor. There are people who are in the stands, there are people at another club, there's other doing things, right? But I'm talking to folks who are actively seeking ways to build this bridge and to make connections and grow and learn together, without the shame and blame and absolutism and the fear and the anger and all the things, or have them and bring them so we can still, have them there together.
Yeah, I feel like the point at which the man says the tears are really triggering for me is usually the point at which the conversation stops, where he says and we apologize, and then it's just like, and the where I want to go, and I think where Tilman wants to go, Michelle, what I'm hearing you want to go is like, so then let's go beyond that. Like, let's go to then, and then what, and then what, right? So that we're not just caught in these prescribed roles, or this is what I'm supposed to think or do or say in X situation. Like, what does it look like to have that authentic connection with one another in the hardest moments?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Our time is almost up, but I do have one question that I know a lot of people will want to know. How do I interrupt when I see it in real time? How do I interrupt problematic behavior or oppressive behavior, or something that, you've seen a million times where somebody says something, you can feel the room shift. You can feel it. And people go where they go, right? But for that person who is a leader in an organization, or that person who's like, I don't want to be silent when I see it. I want to say something, but I freeze. I hear that a lot. I just freeze. I don't know, do I say something, or all the things that you process to be able to not just be a bystander, but like really interact and engage and deal with what's happening in real time. Any thoughts or suggestions that you have for folks who are like, I want to say something, but I'm afraid? White folks.
Yeah. I figure it's for white folks, right? Somebody recently I was coaching said, gosh, I know I'm supposed to work with white folks, but that kind of feeling. And it made me really think, what do I love about white women? Because I've got to be able to really, I say I love white women, but why do I love white women? So, as a white woman, I've got to be pretty grounded in my love and willingness to give grace to white people. I've got to be willing to see myself in them. So, when we make these mistakes, and we do regularly, that instead of blaming, making them feel guilty, spotlighting them like, you idiot, why'd you do that? I can be like, oh, yikes, that was me yesterday, or it will be me in 2 days. Let's talk. Like in the immediate, naming it, but with kindness, with love, without saying you are seriously problematic. Now, if somebody is being seriously problematic, I have a special tone for them too. But this is the person that is just entitled, shows up, the control stuff is coming up, they say something that just lands like a thud. And then everybody's silent, but everybody's hurting. I found just one interruption. Hey, I've done that. I've done that. I'm with you. And so that you can connect with them. They don't feel alone. They don't feel ashamed, hopefully, as possible. And I take the risk that so people of color don't have to.
Yeah. I just wish there was a way that we had language to articulate where I am in my racial competence, right? Like, I'm a freshman. Okay. Oh, okay. Got it. I'm a senior. What am I missing? Like, when you are, there's a way to be accountable, but also grow. There's just it's just hard because we hold people as you're racist or you're not. And there's no in between way there's no spectrum of fluency that we can say, oh, okay, you're a level 4. Oh, you're a freshman, or you're whatever the language is. I think it would really prove to be valuable if we could say, I'm a freshman here and I'm looking forward to graduating or being a senior. What does that look like? but what we do now is that the seniors are like going to the middle school and bullying the kids and mad because they don't know calculus.
Yes, and
Mhm.
I think that's why we developed this developmental model.
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
don't stay in balance, and we go back and forth. And on any given moment, I can find myself right back in immersion.
Mhm.
That moment where I saw the babysitter come.
Mhm.
I didn't intend to be a horrible racist, but bam, I was there immediately,
Mhm.
right? So for us to understand that that is me, I see myself in you. I'm no better. So we better do this together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think
And
for any white leader listening, white woman leader, my appeal is that you start to find yourself a consultant. I don't know who, I know a few people, but find yourself a grace equity consultant that can support you in creating a restorative culture versus a punitive culture. Because when it's a punitive culture, folks of color most often suffer. But when you have a restorative culture, it instinctively says not what did they do wrong, but what's missing here? What did this environment breed that has this experience happening consistently, right? And it has you look at environment. A restorative culture has you, especially as it relates to conflict, it has you look at a person. You have to look at their humanity because that's part of the model. Like, what did you not get in this space that had you take this step? Now, some people, even after restoration, you end up firing somebody sometimes, but it's never an attack on one's dignity. And, it's always oh, wow, we missed the mark on something. And it allows people to then come back from their mistakes. It holds people as redeemable. And I think things like cancel culture says you're not redeemable, you're canceled. There's no mechanism for communication or conversation in those models. So you were going to say something, Ilsa.
oh, I was just thinking about the reason that I tell myself that I'm not interrupting something.
Mm.
Oh, I don't have the right word. So I'm worried I'm going to make things worse. So, I don't know if the people of color in the room want me to. And so we have all of these stories. And I would say that a first place for white people to start is to really interrogate the fears that you have
Yep.
around and the stories that you've told yourself around why you don't interrupt, and see if that does hold up, or see if really at the root of it, it's that I'm worried that I might look racist.
Mm.
And because I think that's what it comes down to, right?
Yep.
And so then to remember, and what does it mean to instead focus on being anti-racist? And
Absolutely.
if I could share a little illustration that somebody shared in a workshop I did on Friday, which I loved. Oh, okay. Oh, she was saying sitting next to somebody who's driving a car, and somebody cuts you off in traffic, and I'm the passenger in the car. If I reach over and honk the horn, it might have the immediate effect of letting the person know that they cut me off, but then who faces all the repercussions of me honking the horn? And so thinking about that as a metaphor for white people who think that we're being allies to people of color when we honk that horn, when we're the ones who call somebody out rather than inviting them in with grace in the way that you illustrated, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I love metaphors, and that was a really great one. So we are wrapping up now. And as a standing tradition, now I can call it on my fourth or fifth show here, a tradition, we have a fill in the blank question. So I'll have you go first. Tilman, grace is.
Grace is centering relationships and love above all else.
Thank you. Ilsa?
Grace is necessary to telling the truth about myself, about society, which then allows us to move to a place of reparations, reconciliation, justice, and belonging.
Well, thank you very much. All right, everyone. I hope you enjoy spending time with us today. I'm sure I will have y'all back. There's always more to talk about. But thank you so much for spending time with us. And everybody, will see you next week.